Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm 𝔼𝐻𝐼, this is Capricorn, and today we're back at it with another spoiler video for Magic the Gathering's Edge of Eternity's expansion. This is going to cover days 5, 6, and 7, aka the weekend spoilers. And you might be saying to yourself, isn't this video coming out a little bit late if it's covering all of the weekend spoilers? And you would be correct. I just got back from a family vacation. We went camping, we had a blast, but the entire time I was a little bit anxious because I knew that back home spoiler season was just trucking on without me. And now that I'm finally back home from vacation, I can get caught up on all of the crazy spoilers that we missed, get up to date so that we can pick up right where we left off, and keep all of the new spoiler stuff coming out to you guys as soon as we possibly can. So we're going to get through all of these spoilers. A couple more videos are coming. I'm really excited about this set, and we're going to dive right in. If you would be so kind as to hit that like button, it does help the video get out to more people. It helps the channel grow, and I need it now more than ever since I did have to go away for 4 or 5 days on vacation, and I'm kind of trying to get back in the good graces of the YouTube algorithm now that I'm finally back at it. So please hit that like button. If you're new here, subscribe because we have a ton of crazy spoiler content on the way. We're not done just yet. And then after that, we've got deck techs, and early access is right around the corner. That's happening on Wednesday. And for those of you that don't know, I do a 24-hour marathon stream over on Twitch, and we start doing every crazy deck we can come up with, all of the new archetypes, exploring all the new craziness, and deck techs for each of those decks start to drop the exact same day and every single day after that, with all the crazy new things that you guys are most excited to see. So if you have ideas about decks you'd like to see me run, definitely let me know in the comments. And join me for that 24-hour marathon stream that's happening over at twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now let's dig into these cards. First off, we've got Cryogen Relic, an artifact for 1 blue and 1. When it enters or leaves the battlefield, you draw a card. You can also pay 1 blue and 1, sacrifice this artifact to put a stun counter on up to 1 target tapped creature. I really like this card. As a common, it's going to be really good in limited, specifically because you can sack it to stun something, which is awesome. And then draw 2 cards off of it as well. It's effectively 4 mana, draw 2 cards, put a stun counter on something. That seems fine as a common to me, but where this gets really interesting is potentially in Standard. You could use this in a sacrifice style deck so that you can put it onto the battlefield, sacrifice it to get some other beneficial effects, and draw cards in the process of doing that, which could be really, really interesting. Also, a few different times in these spoiler videos, I have brought up the fact that it looks like flicker decks are going to be a big deal in the new Standard. There's just so much gas coming that is prime for flickering to be absolutely nuts. And this is another card that does that because it specifies enters or leaves. It doesn't say, you know, sacrificed or destroyed or goes to the graveyard or anything like that. So if you could just flicker this thing or even just pick it up, if you could just pick this up with like a nurturing pixie or something like that, that's interesting as well. So I think there are a lot of different ways to use this. I think it's going to be good in multiple formats, but just having that ability to sack and put a stun counter on something does mean it's going to be pretty good in limited as well. Otherwise, if you just had that first ability, it could still be really good in other formats, but it wouldn't really do much of anything in limited. So pretty interesting that it has that built in. Next up, we've got Melded Moxite, an artifact for 1 red and 1. When it enters, you may discard a card, and if you do, draw 2 cards. So this is a variation of the same sort of card that we see every set, where you get to, you know, discard something, draw 2. In the case of this one, it is an artifact, so it gives you a little bit of extra oomph, a little something to synergize with in decks that want artifacts, in which there will be plenty after this set drops. It also has this second ability where you pay 3, sacrifice this artifact, create a tapped 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token, which is kind of interesting. So if you don't have anything better to use the actual artifact for, you can just get a creature. Having a creature eventually, and also trigger potentially any sort of like death triggers or destroy triggers off this artifact being sacrificed, is a little bit of silver lining value that I really like. And no matter what you're discarding one, drawing 2. So this just feels like strict upside, strictly better than the normal versions of this kind of card that we see. And there's just a lot to like. At least as far as a common, I think this card is really, really good. But next up, we've got Lux Knight Breacher. This is a 2/2 human knight for 1 white and 3, and it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature and or artifact you control. If it was just creature, that would be one thing, and it would still be pretty alright for limited. But the fact that it hits artifacts as well is kind of nuts. You can go wide with a whole bunch of artifacts that aren't even necessarily creatures, that are hard for your opponent to remove. They can't just use their run-of-the-mill creature removal, and then just basically make sure that you enable yourself to drop this, and it's a huge creature. It's almost always going to come down as, you know, a 4-drop that gives you more power and toughness than what a 4-drop would normally give you. It's also a human. It's also a knight. It also seems maybe okay for Convoke style decks that are just vomiting a whole bunch of stuff out as quickly as they possibly can. Although 4 mana is a fair amount, especially when it can just get eaten up by removal. So I don't really see this seeing a whole lot of constructed play, but I think in limited this card's going to be really important and really good. Especially, like I said, considering the fact that it's a common, is kind of gnarly. This could be a pretty nuts top end, especially if you're careful to only play it after your opponent runs out of their removal suite. But next up, we've got Radiant Strike, an instant for 1 white and 3, destroy target artifact or tapped creature, and gain 3 life. This is just like Disenchant on crack. At least that's what it feels to me. Disenchant was such a staple back in the day that it's just like drilled into my brain as the de facto standard, even though we've long surpassed it, right? Still, 4 mana, instant speed, destroy an artifact, instead of an enchantment, destroy a tapped creature. Way more important, way more impactful, especially in limited. And then gaining 3 life helps you mitigate some of that damage you took early from aggro, help try and take back the race, win the race. It just seems really cool. It's not super good, right? It's expensive, but it is extremely versatile, and it's instant speed, so it can do a lot. I like it. Next up, we've got Drixs Fatemaker, a 3/2 Drix wizard for 1 green and 3. When it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample. You can also warp it for 1 green and 1. So, basically, I keep having something in my eye here. Maybe it's all the pine needles I was sleeping under. Anyway, you warp this out for 2 mana. Not only do you get a +1/+1 counter, temporarily gain some trample on some of your creatures, and also possibly get the ability to use this to station one of your spacecraft 3 more charge counters, and then it gets exiled, and later on you pay 4, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on something again. And if that first thing still has the counter on it, now you've got at least 2 creatures that have trample, and that seems pretty good. In fact, the second time you can just choose to put the counter on itself if you want, so that it's a 4/3 trampler for 4. That alone seems pretty on rate. A 4/3 trampler for 4 that can also give you a little bit of extra gas early in the game, and even more gas if you can use it to its maximum efficiency by having like spacecraft a station and stuff like that. I just sort of love everything about that. These commons are sort of knocking it out of the park in my opinion. Although, that's just kind of par the course these days with the way they've changed how they allocate cards in sets for play boosters now. It seems like there really aren't any commons that are useless. They're all kind of playable. But even so, I think this one's a pretty good one. Again, just keep in mind the fact that the absolute bottom, the floor of this card is it's a 4 mana, 4/3 trampling that has a counter in case anything cares about that, you know, modified creatures or whatnot, any kind of synergies you might have. And all of that's really good. So even if you don't warp it, I think this guy's pretty decent for a common. I'll definitely be playing him in limited, 100%. Next up, we've got Atmospheric Greenhouse. I believe this is our first uncommon today. Or I shouldn't say today, in this video. This is a 5/4 flying, trampling spacecraft for 1 green and 4. It requires 8+ charge counters to become a creature with the station ability. But also, when this spacecraft enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That's really good. See, maybe it's not like really good, but it's definitely really good. Being able to buff up your whole team right away for that 5 mana and get an artifact, which may or may not add some negligible value even if you don't station it up to 8, is kind of a decent amount. But what's really cool is the first ability kind of helps you enable the second. So you can put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on all your little dudes, and then they get bigger so that you don't have to tap as many of them in order to station this thing to 8+ charge counters. And since this card wants you to go super wide with creatures before you play it anyway, that 8+ charge counters isn't going to feel as much as it normally would under other circumstances, because this is slotting into your deck in the place of like a finisher spell, like an overrun or something like that, where you're just buffing up your whole team after you've already gotten everything else out, and just adding all of that extra value to your board presence, but then also potentially being able to have this 5/4 flying trample spacecraft when all is said and done. And I just kind of love that. I love the sort of elegance of the fact that its first ability enables it to turn into a creature that much quicker. And I think people that draft this correctly and run it correctly are going to do very, very well, because flying and trample is nothing to scoff at in Limited, and making your entire team huge so you only need to tap like a few creatures to station this thing up is also amazing. Yeah, I think this card's going to be really sweet. Next up, we've got Hilderblade. I think this may have been one that we saw in one of the leaked videos that I did last week, but we're still going to cover it here for posterity. This is 1 black mana for an artifact equipment. It equips for 4 colorless. An equipped creature gets +3/+1. 4 colorless is a lot. I know exactly what you're thinking, and you're right, it is a lot. But this also has a void ability, so at the beginning of your end step, if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn or a spell was warped this turn, you attach this equipment to target creature you control. So basically, if you're playing this in the right deck, building the right deck around it, and making the right decisions, this is almost always going to equip for free at the end of every single one of your turns. All you have to do is kill one of their things, bounce one of their things, flicker one of your things, warp something in. There's like a million different ways you can trigger Void, because it cares about your stuff and their stuff. So if either of you warp something, or either of you has a non-land permanent leave the battlefield, it's going to trigger everyone's Void abilities, which I kind of like, and I don't think people have really caught on to how interesting that's going to make Limited feel in this set. And I'm excited for the light bulb moments when people start to realize how easy it is to get Void, and how, like, oh, if your opponent triggers their Void, then, you know, maybe they have to risk triggering your Void, depending on, you know, when things line up. If they're trying to use instant speed removal on your turn, they could end up triggering your Void, which is cool. I think there's just a lot of interesting little bits and pieces to explore with how Void works. And I think that makes this card really, really cool. At the end of the day, it's not anything super crazy. It's just an equipment that's going to buff your dude. But if you could be super consistent with triggering your Void, being able to get a free +3/+1 buff that only ever costs you 1 mana to play is not nothing. Especially, like I said, if you can trigger Void pretty easily every turn because your deck is built around it, being able to put it on the best possible creature to use it every turn, and then, you know, if they kill it, you just move it to something else at the end of your next turn, could be really, really good. So it sort of depends on what the card pool looks like as a whole, but I have a feeling in the right decks, this is going to be a very powerful card in Limited. Let's move on to Close Encounter. This is definitely one that we saw in the earlier leaked videos last week. This is an instant for 1 green and 1. As an additional cost to cast it, you choose a creature you control or a warped creature card you own in exile, and then Close Encounter deals damage equal to the power of the chosen creature or card to target creature. I really like this. It's a bite spell, it's instant speed, so you can use it when your opponent doesn't see it coming, you know, catch them with their pants down. But also you can just use it targeting a creature in warp, which means you could get a really high power creature into position to be able to target with the Close Encounter without spending a ton of mana, because most of the warp costs are very, very cheap. So you've got this extra value of, you know, play a really cheap warp thing, it goes into exile, and maybe it's going to be a long time till you can play it again, but it's got high power, and it doesn't matter if it takes you a long time to play it again, it still turns on for close encounter. And it's a really good way of getting like a very effective high damage removal spell somewhat earlier in the game while you're curving out, before you get to the point where you can actually cast these big giant creatures for their normal cost, because they're sitting there exiled with warp. And I think that's going to be a really interesting play line to sort of build around. I'm really excited to use this one in Limited for sure. It even has a chance to see play in Standard. Again, it really kind of depends on how good the warp creatures end up being and if that's a relevant deck. If you can consistently be warping out high power creatures, it's possible this ends up being one of the better options for your removal suite in that Standard deck. But again, we're gonna have to wait until we see the entire set spoiled. Next up, we've got Lightless Evangel, a 2/2 vampire cleric for 1 black and 1. Whenever you sacrifice another creature or artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This is really cool because it's pretty much on rate for 2 mana. I mean, maybe not today with how pushed Standard is and power leap everywhere. There's just power leap everywhere. But a 2/2 for 2 mana that has 2 relevant creature types is kind of good. And the fact that you don't have to sacrifice something to this to get the +1/+1 counter, instead it's when you sacrifice something to other abilities you get the +1/+1 counter. If you can build around that properly, that's actually way better, because you get whatever the other sacrifice ability is, triggered when you're sacrificing it, and you get the +1/+1 counter. So you're not locked into specifically having to sacrifice something to just get this +1/+1 counter. You get whatever other value you would normally sacrifice it for, and you get a +1/+1 counter on this. And I don't know, I kind of love that. I'm really excited about this potentially being some kind of an archetype in Limited. At this point, it kind of has to be, right? Some kind of like artifact sacrifice style deck. Very interesting, considering the fact that we have a lot of artifacts that with ETB abilities like the spacecraft that you could then use as extra gas for sacrifice fodder, even if you never intend to turn them into creatures by stationing them. And I really hope that when the entire set is spoiled and everything comes together, the Limited archetypes actually end up flowing together that elegantly, because it really seems like there was a lot of care and attention given to all of the different mechanics in this set and how they interact with each other, which I just really like. I just do. Next up, we've got Dauntless Scrapbot, a 3/1 artifact creature robot for 3 colorless mana. When this creature enters, you exile each opponent's graveyard and then create a lander token. This thing just gives you everything, man. For something that's colorless that you can just literally put into any deck in Limited, I absolutely love this. It counts as an artifact, it works for those synergies, it's a 3-power 3-drop that you can run regardless of your colors, that can trade reasonably well with other 3-drops, but it also gives you just like a free lander token and just incidentally gets to exile a graveyard as well. It's almost like you have this way of including all of these really cool sideboardy type things. I shouldn't say all of these sideboardy type things. Really, exiling the graveyard's the only sideboardy type thing that you incidentally get here as like a free bonus. It's almost like you get to pre-sideboard have a way to deal with decks that are trying to interact with their graveyard a lot, which is awesome. But the fact that it gives you a lander token, it's giving you 2 permanents on the battlefield at the same time. One can trade decently well at least, and the other one's going to ramp you or fix you or just be used as artifact fodder for the sacrifice decks. This just does everything? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of understated for its cost to a certain extent, but again, it's colorless. You can just kind of fit it into anything. You could do a lot worse. You could do a lot worse than to find ways of fixing. I'm tired. Need more coffee. You could do a lot worse finding ways of mana fixing your deck in Limited, especially if you're not using green, than to simply use Dauntless Scrapbot. I think it has a place in a lot of 3-color decks in Limited that don't have green, and that need ways to fix. And there are a lot of ways to do that in this set with the lander tokens. And this seems like one of the better ones because you also get a body. You're not sacrificing board presence in order to get that mana fixing or that mana ramp. And you just get to incidentally include Graveyard Hate because why not, I guess? Because power leap, power creep. We're going to move on. Next up, we've got Honored Knight Captain, a 1/1 human advisor knight for 1 white and 1. When it enters, you create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Oh god. They're doing it. They're doing it. It doesn't have the flash, but in every other way, it's a strictly better version of, what was that card called? The one with flash that makes a 1/1 token. You'll remind me in the comments. You always do. He also has an ability here. Pay 2 white and 4, sacrifice this creature, search your library for an equipment card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. That's actually really good. That seems super pushed, man. Like, you get 2 1/1s for 2, which is already kind of good, especially if you're in, like, a Convoke deck, or a deck where you're going to be antheming your creatures up. You just get more out of this one card, giving you 2 bodies. But then also, like, you sack 1 to find your best equipment. You don't have to worry about playing it. It just goes straight onto the battlefield. And you still get to keep the other 1/1 creature token that you made when you played it. Everything about this just seems great. It's going to be really good in Standard, I think. In some of, like, the Boros equipment decks. This has to see play in some kind of a weird, like, Convoke style deck in Standard, right? I think it's good enough. Yeah. This has to be good enough. Let me know in the comments how you feel about this card, where you think it will see play. I'm thinking Convoke, possibly the Boros equipment decks, and it's definitely going to be nuts in Limited. If you see this in Limited, you're probably going to want to grab it pretty high, and then just try to find at least an equipment to run, so that you do have some sort of value you can maybe get later, and then you're golden. But even if you never find an equipment with this, I think it's still a fine card in Limited. It's a card where you could take it early, even if you don't know if you're going to have equipment, and not hate the fact that you're running it. But then if you do take it early, now you're paying attention to all of the equipment. And if you get just a couple really good equipment cards, having that versatility of which one you can search for, depending on the board state and what's going on in your game, could just be really, really nuts. So, I just like this card. I feel like I'm saying that about everything. I've been gone for 5 days camping, and I've just started looking at these cards right now, so I'm excited. Leave me alone. Let me like a thing. I don't have to hate everything. I can like stuff. Let's move on. Next up, we have our first rare of the day. This is Synthesizer Lab Ship, a 4/4 artifact spacecraft for just 1 blue mana. Has the station ability, and if you station it up to just 2+ charge counters, at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 other target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 2/2, and gains flying until end of turn. And then if you station it up to 9+ charge counters, it itself becomes a 4/4 with flying and vigilance. Very, very cool card when it only costs you 1 mana. I feel like the decks that care about artifact synergies, whether it's sacrificing them or maybe just going wide with them to get extra value out of certain cards in your deck, are going to love this because it's just a really cheap artifact. All you ever have to do is just tap 2 power worth of creatures at some point, incidentally, when you have an opening to do so, and you turn on this ability to basically, like, any one of your artifact creatures can just swing in for 2 in the air, or I guess non-creature artifacts can just swing in for 2 in the air every turn and just get in for a little bit of damage. And if that's all it ever does, maybe this ability turns on and you get in for some damage, and then it's not enough at some point, you sacrifice it to some ability. It just seems really cool. But if you kind of like stalemate the board and you're sort of stuck where neither side has enough leverage to really swing in, this can break up a board stall too, because you just tap your dudes and get it up to 9 counters and start swinging in the air for 4 while also holding back a 4/4 flying blocker because of the vigilance. And that will end games really, really quick, especially if your opponent only has smaller flyers or no flyers at all. I think this one's going to get overlooked because it seems like it doesn't do a lot on the surface. But I think the fact that it only costs 1 mana is actually really, really huge. You can slip this out super early, and it kind of flies under the radar, pun intended, and just your opponent doesn't really think it's going to do a whole lot, and then I think it will over the course of the game. If you're in a really go-wide artifact deck, you have plenty of targets to just turn into 2/2 flyers until end of turn and just get there. And then, you know, you're turning on other artifact synergies by having a cheap 1-mana artifact with the Synthesizer Lab ship itself. I think there's a lot to like about this card. I think this is going to be a sleeper. I don't think it's going to be like absolutely insane, but I think there's going to be a number of decks that want to go wide with artifacts that are going to want something like this that gives you a little bit of value, but also just gives you an artifact for 1 mana. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Beyond the Quiet. This is another one that was definitely leaked early in one of the leak videos that we covered last week. And this card makes me very sad because I was so excited for Sunfall to rotate. I was literally counting down the weeks since like 4 sets ago until Sunfall was finally going to rotate out. I hate Sunfall. This is Beyond the Quiet. 2 white and 3 for a sorcery. Exile all creatures and spacecraft. I'm just facepalming. Personally, I think that normal destruction sweepers are hard enough to play around, and that it's a good way to show your skill as a player if you see it coming and you sort of play around it properly, and that takes definitely a certain amount of skill as it is. And I think going beyond that and adding free extra value in the form of exiling is just too much. I think it hurts anything that cares about the graveyard, any deck that cares about the graveyard at all, Reanimator decks, decks that center around flashback, any of that kind of stuff. It also hurts any decks that care about death triggers, sacrifice style decks, aristocrat style decks, all that stuff. All of those decks become a lot more unplayable in a format where something like this exists. It's fine to have exile, but a lot of times I just feel like a lot of that exile should be sort of like a sideboard option. I think just getting to exile everything with your sweeper so that you have like a main deck thing that messes up Reanimator and messes up graveyard decks and messes up sacrifice decks and aristocrats decks and death trigger decks, like just having that incidentally included on your sweeper is just too much. Like not having to sideboard into the ability to deal with all of those things and instead just, oh, I just happen to have it in my main deck is the most obnoxious thing in the world to me. It makes all of those archetypes less playable, and then the sweeper just runs rampant over the format. We saw it with Sunfall, and a lot of you guys will probably argue that what truly made Sunfall broken was the fact that you got the token, and it gave you board presence, and you're not wrong. That is definitely the best part of Sunfall. That's the part that pushes it into the stratosphere, but I think even without that token, just exiling everything instead of destroying everything is too much. It's just, you completely wipe out any of those kinds of decks' chance to come back from the wipe. So it's too difficult to play around a wipe and also lose all of that. I just hate it. I guess it's not as bad as Farewell, right? Farewell was worse because it would also exile the graveyard and exile this and exile that, and I just hate it, man. I don't want any more of it. I was so excited for Sunfall to rotate, and now it's just back and also hits your spacecraft. Great. I hate it. Great. Wonderful. Let's move on. Loading Zone. 1 green and 3 for an enchantment. It warps for just 1 green mana. If 1 or more counters would be put on a creature, spacecraft, or planet you control, twice that many of each of those kinds of counters are put on it instead. I love this card. I don't know how good it will be. I'm tempted to say it'll be really good. We've seen cards like this in the past that just didn't quite make the cut because it's like a 4 mana do nothing in your hand that you have to be in the right board state to really take a turn off and get value out of this. But the warp kind of throws a wrench into that. You could theoretically warp this out as you're curving, and when you're going to trigger a bunch of counters type things that are going to put counters on your stuff, and it basically turns into like a sorcery in a way. It's like you're just spending 1 green mana on a spell that says double all counters you get this turn. that's a good spell, I think. In the right deck that really cares about that stuff enough, I think that's a good spell. And it's not a good enough spell on its own to be absolutely amazing, but if that spell comes stapled to another thing that you can cast later on for 4 mana that gives you that spell ability forever for the rest of the game from that point on, I think that's really good. Because you're never going to sit there in this hand unable to use it at all. Worst case scenario, you warp it out. You don't get as much value on it as you'd like because maybe there was something you could spend for 1 mana to put a counter on something or counters on something that you now can't play because you had to spend that mana to warp this. Whatever the case may be. But it's not going to sit in your hand doing nothing. You're not going to be in a situation where like, oh, all I have is this 4-drop and my opponent's wrecking my face and I don't have time to take advantage of this 4-drop. At the very least, you can just warp it, get some value, even if it's not as much as you'd like to get, and then it's just going to sit in exile forever. And if you never have a window to play it from exile, at least you got some value, right? But then if you do get a window to play it from exile, you can just just snowball that value into insanity over the course of the rest of the game. So having both modes, I think, actually makes this card really playable. I think if it was just the spell, the warp, or whatnot, it wouldn't do quite enough. But also if it was just the 4 mana enchantment, it would be a little bit expensive and hard to fit into your curve and that sort of thing. Hard to take time off of putting board presence onto the board to do. The fact that you get both in the same card is what I think makes it playable. And I'm excited to see how playable it actually ends up being, especially in Standard. So if you have ideas about what sort of decks you'd use this in, I'm maybe considering, I know I said this a bunch of times in other videos, but Jenova, I really love Jenova right now. I'm kind of on a Jenova kick. I'm excited to experiment more with Jenova after this set comes out because I think there are a lot of interesting cards that work well with her. I think this could be another one. But if you have other ideas, let me know in the comments, because I think this card is cool. Next up, we've got Lumen Class Frigate. This is an artifact spacecraft for just 1 white and 1. It stations, and when it stations up to 2+ charge counters, just 2, other creatures you control get +1/+1. So it's sort of like a Glorious Anthem, except it's an artifact instead of an enchantment. It costs 1 mana less, but it requires you to tap a 2-power creature before it turns on. That seems fine, right? But then if you also station this up to 12+ counters, it turns into a 3/5 flying lifelink itself. And that's where things get interesting. In a similar fashion to what I was talking about with the last card, either one of these by itself, I don't think would be good enough. But the fact that you get them both on the same card is actually really, really good in my opinion. Antheming all of your creatures, even if you do have to tap a 2-power creature to get there, 2 1/1s or whatever, is still pretty decent on curve. And then the fact that you have extra value you can just suck out of this later on in the game. If you have a window, some breathing room, where you can just tap enough power to station this thing up, it becomes an absolutely perfect game ender. Not insanely powered or anything like that, but the lifelink will absolutely make a difference. The 5 toughness is going to make it hard for your opponent to kill it, and even if they do block it, you're gaining life every time, or you're holding it back as a blocker that's going to gain you life every time, and that's just really awesome. Another thing I want to point out about this that's similar to the green spacecraft we saw a while ago is the first ability here sort of enables the second one. Getting this to 2 charge counters and turning on this Anthem effect for the rest of your team means that they're all going to get bigger, and you won't have to use as many creatures to station this thing up to 12 as you would have if you didn't have the Anthem effect. So it's kind of like one hand washes the other, and I really like it. Another thing you kind of have to take into account that's really easy to overlook and makes evaluating these spacecraft a little harder is the fact that you don't have to station everything all at once. It's not like you have to station to 2 in one swoop, and then you have to station to 12 in one swoop. It's like, if you just have a dude that's not really going to be good attacking or blocking and is just kind of sitting there, just tap him every turn. You know, add a counter, 2 counters, 3 counters, whatever it is, and over the course of a few turns, you can get this thing stationed up with a card that otherwise wasn't really going to do anything and was going to sit there. And I think a lot of that is going to add value to these cards in ways that is really, really hard to anticipate. And I do think people are going to underestimate the spacecraft at first. They're going to think that they're really slow, and that they take too much to get going. And to a certain extent, they're right, but they're not as right as they think they are. I think some of these spacecraft are actually going to be way better than they look on the surface. And I think there are ways to efficiently get the power you need to station these things up without losing too much. There are plenty of situations, especially in Limited, where you're going to have stalled board states and you have certain creatures that aren't really good at attacking or blocking because of the current board state. Now you have ways to use all of that and it doesn't feel like wasted power on the field. And I kind of love that. So I think this card's actually pretty good, and I'm excited to see just how good it ends up being. But next up, we've got Sir Vondam, Sunstar Exemplar, a 2/2 legendary human knight with vigilance and menace for just 2 mana in the colors of Orzhov. This is another one that we saw in an earlier leaked video last week that I covered, but again, we're still going to cover it here for posterity in case some of you guys watching haven't seen those leaked videos. This thing has 2 other abilities. Whenever another creature you control dies or is put into exile, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sir Vondam, and you gain a life. I don't know why you also gain a life. This seems super pushed. So every time another creature you control dies or is put into exile, not only does Sir Vondam get a counter, but he also triggers all of like your Ajani's Pridemate style creatures to also get counters because you get a life gain trigger. That seems kind of awesome. And then you have a second ability here. When Sir Vondam dies or is put into exile, while its power is 4 or greater, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. So as long as 2 of your things die before Sir Vondam dies, Sir Vondam is going to go down swinging and take out whatever non-land permanent you want. Literally anything. And that's kind of nuts. It's cool that you can just get to that 4 power with other things. You can equip it. You can put other counters on it by other means. You can put an aura on it if you want, although that you'd lose a lot more value if you're using an aura. So I don't necessarily recommend that as plan A. But you don't have to use its own ability to get itself to 4 power in order to turn on it being a removal, targeted removal for any non-land permanent. And I think that's kind of interesting. So this card's just relevant in so many different ways. Vigilance and Menace is nuts if this thing starts to stack up counters. And the life gain, even if you don't have things like Pridemates to get triggers off the life gain, even just like racing other aggro decks seems awesome. Could you imagine this against like Mono Red? If it gets up to 4 or 5 power and toughness, this thing is just nuts. They have to hold back 2 blockers and slow down their aggression if they want to block it. But if they don't block it, you're swinging in for 5, and you have a 5/5 blocker that can definitely block one of theirs. Like, there's no way for Mono Red aggro to come back from that unless they get lucky and get like 2 removal spells in their hand at the same time and plays them both and kills the Sir Vondam. The fact that you're gaining life also offsets, like, it's just everything, man. This card is going to be nuts in just the right deck. I'm calling it now. I think life gain decks are going to love it. I think sacrifice decks are going to love it. And I think the way in which it gets big and subtly over time and then utilizes that vigilance and menace is absolutely important. It's pushed to high hell because it honestly does not even need to be able to destroy a target non-land permanent at power 4 or greater to be a good card. And the fact that it also does that just makes it nuts. And it has 2 relevant creature types, human and knight. I don't know exactly what deck I'm going to use this in yet. I'm going to probably try it in a life gain deck, some kind of aristocrats deck. Maybe there's some kind of a hybrid between the 2. But if you have ideas about how to use this, definitely let me know in the comments. This one's exciting. I think this one is more exciting than people will give it credit. But let's move on to the last card of the day, and one that has me a little bit worried, although I'm also kind of excited about it. This is Hardlight Containment. An enchantment aura for just 1 white mana. You enchant an artifact you control, and when this aura enters, you exile target creature an opponent controls until this aura leaves the battlefield. Also, the enchanted permanent has Ward 1. Everything about this card is so pushed. 1 mana to exile any creature is nuts. It reminds me of Ossification. Ossification had to be put on a basic land and it costs 2 mana. This has to be put on an artifact and costs 1 mana. It's a little bit harder to have an artifact to target with this, and it's a little bit easier for your opponent to remove that artifact rather than a land for Ossification. So it kind of evens out, in my opinion. This is cheaper, but it has a more difficult hoop to jump through as far as what you have to enchant. That being said, even Ossification could be killed with enchantment removal, and the Hardlight Containment itself can just be destroyed with enchantment removal. So I do kind of feel like they're both equally susceptible to removal. And with Hardlight Containment, you don't have to be running basics. You can run a 3-color deck, a 5-color deck if you want. You just need artifacts. So what I think is that this card's going to be absolutely bonkers in the right decks that are super wide with artifacts. But outside of that, it's not going to be it's not going to be quite as useful as something like Ossification. Ossification, you could just run a monocolor deck or a 2-color deck and just kind of tilt your mana base in the direction of basics, maybe with Fable Passage or whatever, and it was really easy to just run that. This, you need to specifically be in an archetype. You need to run artifacts. That being said, how many artifacts do you really need to make this useful? You don't necessarily need like an all artifact deck. You could have like 3 or 4 playsets, 3 or 4 different artifacts that are really good, and that's probably enough. You just need enough to be super consistent with it. But if you are in like a go wide artifact deck that's going to have plenty of artifacts all over the place, this gets even better. It's also, it kind of feels a little bit like Sheltered by Ghosts too, because it gives the enchanted permanent ward 1. And that means you could put it on something that you don't want your opponent to be able to remove to just get extra protection against it. You could put it on one of your creatures to give the creature ward 1. In fact, you could put it on an artifact creature that also has a Sheltered by Ghost on it, and now that creature will have ward 3, and you will have exiled 2 different things with the 2 different enchantments. That sounds fun. I feel like that's how people are going to use this, but there's definitely like a million ways to use this. There are going to be a crazy ton of artifact decks coming out of this set. In Standard, people are going to be trying so many different varieties of artifact decks. It's going to be wild. Synthesizer decks are going to be all over the place. This set's just looking kind of nuts, and I expect this card to at least be tried in a lot of those decks. Any deck that's running artifacts and is running white is going to try to run this card, I think, because it has the potential to just be the most insanely efficient removal we've gotten since, I don't know, Swords to Plowshares maybe? That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's really good. I think this is really, really good. The ward 1 makes it super pushed. And like I said, I'm a little bit worried about this taking over and 1 mana removal just being par the course moving forward, being like a poor man's Leyline Binding in some ways, but not necessarily having to run domain. So maybe it isn't a poor man's Leyline Binding. Maybe it's just somewhat equal to Leyline Binding. It's hard to say. I mean, this can only hit a creature, right? So it's not as good no matter what. But this card is still kind of nuts. That being said, that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for checking this out. Again, I know this video came a little bit late. I've got a bunch of other ones on the way. I'm going to try to get caught up as quick as I can. And even if you guys have already seen these cards, I do appreciate the support, checking stuff out, leaving me comments, maybe educating me on some of what you learned about this set and ways to use some of these cards while I've been gone on vacation. That would mean a lot to me, so let me know in the comments. I'll see you with another video really soon. Like, subscribe, do the thing. Set's just crazy. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.